Welcome to teleSUR English and join us as we go live to the United Nations as worldwide nations meet for a second day to discuss the need to end the U.S. blockade against Cuba. Let's listen.
To continue the debate on the item. I would now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Peru.
Mr. President, Peru aligns itself with the statement made by St. Vincent and the Grenadines, representing the community of Latin American Caribbean states, and by Azerbaijan on behalf of the non-aligned movement, and that made by Uganda, representing the Group of 77 and China. And we welcome the presence of the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Cuba, Bruno Rodriguez Parilla. Each year, this General Assembly reiterates its firm position on the need to end the economic, commercial, and financial embargo imposed against Cuba. Last year, 185 countries, almost all member states of this organization, expressed the strongest possible support for lifting the embargo. This result reflects the collective and legitimate will, which is in line with the basic norms of international law of the General Assembly. At the same time, it was a clear and evident signal that it's necessary to put an end to this type of unilateral measure so that Cuba can advance on the path of development, meeting the Sustainable Development Goals of the 2030 Agenda. Mr. President, from the most recent report of the Secretary-General, I would like to highlight the response provided by the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner of Human Rights. He concludes that the economic, commercial, and financial embargo imposed on Cuba continues to negatively impact the enjoyment of human rights by the country's population, particularly the most vulnerable people, and reiterates that when unilateral sanctions are directed against an entire country or entire economic sectors, it is the most vulnerable people in that country, the least protected, who will probably be most harmed. It also specifies that the population of those countries are in no way responsible for the policies that are the target of those sanctions, and to a greater or lesser extent have already been living in a precarious situation for a long time and are not responsible for that. Also, the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights gives examples that illustrate how the embargo particularly affects the rights to health, adequate nutrition, adequate education of the Cuban people. Mr. President, Peru does not agree with the imposition of unilateral sanctions of any kind. The only legitimate sanctions are those adopted by the Security Council in the context of the exercise of its powers for the maintenance of international peace and security, in accordance with Chapter 7 of the Charter. And even in those cases, such sanctions are clearly delimited. For example, a couple of weeks ago, the Security Council unanimously approved Resolution 2700, renewing the sanctions regime against Haiti. In its preamble, it specified once again that the measures imposed by this resolution are not intended to have adverse humanitarian consequences for the civilian population, and that their relevance will be examined on an ongoing basis. The unanimous adoption reflects that for all members of the Security Council, including its permanent members, it's important to consider the adverse humanitarian consequences for the civilian population. That should be a consideration that applies in the case of every state without any distinction. In the context of the multiple crises that we are experiencing, any action that affects directly people's living conditions generates consequences on various levels, and its impact can be structural, multidimensional, cross-cutting, or can be a multiplier of underlying causes. Therefore, any measure that has adverse humanitarian consequences for the population of any state or any nation must be eliminated or suspended immediately. Mr. President, Peru shares the view of practically the entire international community in considering that the embargo on Cuba is against the principles and purposes of the United Nations Charter, as well as against international human rights covenants. Consequently, Peru once again expresses that it will vote in favor of the draft resolution entitled "The Necessity of Ending the Economic, Commercial and Financial Embargo Imposed by the United States of America against Cuba as part of a state policy that we have followed without interruption for more than 30 years. Thank you very much."
I should like to thank the distinguished representative of Peru and now invite the distinguished representative of Chile to take the floor.
Señor Presidente.
Mr. President, allow me to begin by congratulating the delegation of Cuba, headed by the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Bruno Rodriguez. I also wish to express my gratitude for the presentation of Draft Resolution A/78/L.5 on the necessity of ending the economic, commercial, and financial embargo imposed by the United States of America against Cuba. In previous years, this resolution has enjoyed the support of the majority of the United Nations member states. Chile is committed to effective multilateralism and as such reaffirms its staunch support for the purposes and principles enshrined in the United Nations Charter and international law. These principles include that of sovereign equality of states, non-intervention and non-interference in internal affairs, and the freedom of international commerce and navigation. For more than 30 years in a row, the General Assembly has been adopting by an overwhelming majority resolutions which call for an end to the economic, commercial, and financial embargo imposed by the United States. Chile wishes to reaffirm its conviction that the implementation of unilateral coercive measures runs counter to international law. Chile does not agree with the imposition of unilateral sanctions of any kind. The only legitimate sanctions are those adopted by the Security Council in the exercise of its authority for the maintenance of international peace and security in accordance with Chapter 7 of the United Nations Charter. Mr. President, the embargo has created and continues to create shortages, hardship and suffering for all of the Cuban people. It stymies and erodes economic and social progress and hinders the fulfillment of development goals, including of the Sustainable Development Goals. Consequently, we lament the fact that the embargo imposed unilaterally against Cuba that has remained in force for more than half a century now is still today in force. With that in mind, the Office of the Resident Coordinator System of the United Nations for Operational Activities in Furtherance of Cuba's Development, in its report of the 18th of April 2023, indicated that, and here I quote, "the exclusion of Cuba from international financial institutions may constitute its most significant obstacle, hindering its development and hindering the achievement of Agenda 2030 goals. Moreover, and in accordance with the United Nations Development Programme report dated the 29th of March 2023, the embargo is having an impact on the most vulnerable groups of the population and on human development in general. According to official estimates, the direct and indirect losses that the blockade on the Cuban economy has inflicted since the beginning of 1960, between 1960 and 2022, stand at some $154 billion in current prices. Chile is staunchly convinced that it is only through direct dialogue and using multilateral mechanisms and international law that it will be possible to, and is possible indeed, to settle differences between states. With this in mind, we reaffirm the need to put an end to the blockade on Cuba, as well as to the implementation of extraterritorial measures associated with this policy. We must also end Cuba's inclusion on the list of countries that supposedly sponsor terrorism. The listing there exacerbates the impacts of the blockade. Mr. President, it has clearly emerged over the last 60 years of the implementation of coercive measures on unilateral coercive measures against Cuba. It's become clear that the Cuban people can still survive thanks to their dignity, perseverance, and hope. The economic embargo is an anachronism from a bygone age and must be ended now once and for all. Chile will vote in favor of the draft resolution being presented once again as an expression of its belief in commitment to the Cuban people. Thank you.
I should like to thank the distinguished representative of Chile for his statement, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Brazil.
Señor Presidente, distinguidos colegas, Brasil.
Distinguished colleagues, Brazil aligns itself made by St. Vincent and the Grenadines on behalf of the Economic Community of Latin American Caribbean states, and that made by Uganda on behalf of the Group of 77 in China, and we present this in our national capacity. I welcome the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Cuba, His Excellency Mr. Bruno Rodriguez Parilla, and I would like to thank the Secretary-General for his report A/78/84 on this theme. My delegation reiterates its firm opposition to the economic, commercial, and financial embargo imposed by the United States of America against Cuba and the application of extraterritorial national commercial laws that are discriminatory. We do not agree with the imposition of unilateral sanctions of any kind. The only legitimate sanctions are those which are adopted by the Security Council in the context of its exercise of its competence in regard to maintenance of international peace and security and in conformity with Chapter 7 of the United Nations Charter. Over many years, we've been asking for the normalization of relations with Cuba by the government of the United States of America. Our rejection of the economic, commercial, and financial embargo imposed by the United States of America against Cuba since 1962 is almost of international consensus. The sanctions imposed against Cuba have not just generated significant losses for the country in monetary terms over the last 60 years. In qualitative terms, it's also affected without doubt and continues to affect the full enjoyment of the rights of the Cuban people. It prejudices the poorest people who are affected by these unilateral measures through unemployment. The embargo is also an obstacle for the efforts by Cuba to achieve sustainable development goals. Mr. President, the inclusion of Cuba on a list of states sponsoring terrorism of the United States on the 12th of January 2021 worsens the impact of the economic embargo. Putting them on this list lacks any justification, and therefore we call for Cuba to be removed from that list. Enhancing economic relations with Cuba is the proper path to be followed by all countries who are interested in supporting the development of that island and improving the living conditions of millions of Cuban citizens. President Lula, in his opening statement at the 70th session of the General Assembly on the 19th of September, said that Brazil will continue to denounce any measures that are not supported by the UN Charter, such as the economic financial embargo against Cuba, and the intent to list that country as a state co-sponsor of terrorism. This statement today enhances this important and urgent appeal. Mr. President, in conclusion, Brazil will vote in favor of the draft resolution 78L5. Thank you very much.
I should like to thank the distinguished representative of Brazil, and I now invite the distinguished representative of Barbados to take the floor.
Mr. President, Barbados aligns itself with the statements delivered by Uganda on behalf of the Group of 77 in China, by St. Lucia on behalf of the Caribbean community, and by St. Vincent and the Grenadines on behalf of CELAC. The purposes and principles of the United Nations are founded on the respect for sovereign equality of states, non-interference in their internal affairs, the rights of peoples to self-determination, the peaceful settlement of disputes, and the maintenance of friendly relations among states. The peaceful coexistence of our states and the sustainable development of our peoples require us all to abide by these principles. For these reasons, Barbados opposes the imposition of unilateral punitive measures, especially when they involve the extraterritorial application of legislation that violates international law and restricts freedom of trade and navigation and the sovereignty and freedom of states. Barbados views the continued imposition of the economic, commercial, and financial embargo against the Republic of Cuba to run counter to both the letter and the spirit of the UN Charter. Mr. President, the annual report of the Secretary General presents an impressive catalogue of submissions by member states. These highlight a shared perspective of opposition to the efforts to isolate Cuba, which ultimately inhibits the development of normal economic and cultural relations, distorts trade and investment, and impedes legitimate business opportunities among neighboring states. When my Prime Minister, the Honorable Mia Moore-Motley, delivered her remarks at the recent G77 and China summit, which took place in Havana in September of this year, she observed that the indomitable Cuban spirit continues to shine in spite of 60-plus years of a callous, cruel, and crippling economic blockade. Indeed, as part of its submission to the Secretary General's report, the government of Barbados acknowledged with deep appreciation that, in spite of the blockade, Cuba has provided invaluable support to the National Health Service of Barbados, including sending under contract agreement medical personnel to combat the COVID-19 pandemic. Cuba remains a beacon for South-South cooperation. Mr. President, the combination of all that I have said so far, together with the multiple times that we and others have expressed these very sentiments, both within and outside of this Assembly, leaves Barbados with no other option than to reiterate, once again, its call for Cuba to be freed from these harsh and debilitating measures, as well as the removal of Cuba from the State Department's list of countries that allegedly sponsor terrorism, which is equally, if not more, debilitating. Barbados continues to maintain excellent relations with the United States of America and Cuba. In this spirit, too, we further urge the government of the United States to engage in a constructive dialogue with the government of Cuba aimed at normalizing relations. Such a step would remove a source of tension and conflict and improve the prospects for peace, development, and cooperation in our region. In support of these principles of international law and the United Nations Charter, Barbados, as in previous years, fully supports the draft resolution before the General Assembly entitled Necessity of Ending the Economic, Commercial, and Financial Embargo imposed by the United States of America against Cuba. We will vote in favor of the adoption of the draft resolution before the General Assembly. I thank you.
I should like to thank the distinguished representative of Barbados, and I now invite the distinguished representative of Belize to take the floor.
Mr. President, Belize aligns itself with the statements made earlier by St. Lucia on behalf of the Caribbean community, El Salvador on behalf of SICA, and St. Vincent and the Grenadines on behalf of the community of Latin American and Caribbean states, as well as the statements made by Uganda on behalf of the Group of 77 and China, and Azerbaijan on behalf of the non-aligned movement. And we welcome the presence of the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Cuba, His Excellency Bruno Rodriguez. Belize registers again its unequivocal condemnation of the economic, commercial, and financial embargo imposed by the United States of America against Cuba. For over 3 decades, the General Assembly has consistently and with near unanimity called for the end of the illegal, immoral, and unjustified financial, commercial, and trade embargo imposed on Cuba. And yet, the embargo continues to not only be imposed, but intensified by the United States against Cuba in audacious defiance of the Charter of the United Nations, international law, and the resounding call of this General Assembly through 30 successive resolutions. Mr. President, all members of the United Nations have a duty to respect and adhere to the purposes and principles of the UN Charter, including respect for sovereignty, non-interference, the peaceful settlement of disputes, and the maintenance of friendly relations among states. There are no exceptions for violations of international law, and there is no member state above the law. The unilateral economic, commercial, and financial embargo imposed by the United States of America is a clear violation of the Charter and international law. Extraterritorial applications of third states' laws is contrary to the letter and spirit of the provisions of the Charter and undermines the principles of multilateralism to which we are all committed. We furthermore reject the designation of the United States of Cuba on its list of state sponsors of terrorism, a measure which only serves to exacerbate further and compound the inhumane consequences of the embargo. Mr. President, the Secretary General's report A7881-84 documents in harrowing details the impact and cost of the embargo on Cuba. In 1 year, the embargo caused estimated losses of over $4.8 billion to the Cuban economy. The embargo has had the deliberate effect of hindering Cuba's recovery from COVID-19, frustrating its sustainable development, and isolating it from the international trade and financial system. Even more unconscionable were the attempts to deny Cuba access to medical supplies during the pandemic itself. Notwithstanding the toll that the embargo has caused Cuba, the Cuban spirit of resilience, ingenuity, generosity, and brotherhood has characterized its engagement with Belize and developing countries globally. Cuba continues to be a force for goodwill and development in our region. Cuban doctors are an integral part of Belize's healthcare system. Many Belizean students receive scholarships for professional training in Cuba in areas as diverse as medicine, physical education, computer science, mathematics, and veterinary medicine. And Cuba continues to provide technical assistance in critical areas including climate change, response, and agriculture. Belize stands in solidarity with Cuba and will vote in support of Resolution L.5. We reiterate our call for the United States to immediately and unconditionally lift the embargo it has illegally imposed on Cuba. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Belize, and I now invite the distinguished representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran to take the floor.
In the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful, Mr. President, I would like to begin by warmly welcoming His Excellency Bruno Rodriguez Parilla, Honorable Minister for Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Cuba, to this important meeting. Iran associates itself with the statement made on behalf of the Group of Friends in defense of the Charter of the United Nations, the Group of 77, and China, as well as the 9/11 movement countries. We would also like to express our appreciation to the Secretary General for his report, which presents the views of member states condemning the unilateral and extraterritorial economic, commercial, and financial embargo imposed by the United States of America on Cuba. Distinguished colleagues, it has been more than 60 years since the United States unilaterally imposed an illegal and immoral embargo on Cuba. Its effect continued to limit the possibility for Cubans' economic growth, curb foreign investment, hinder trade relations with third countries, and create the maximum possible barriers to banking and other financial operations. For all these decades, the blockade paradigm has benefited no one. The government and people of Cuba, through its decisive vote in favor of the resolution calling for the removal of the U.S. embargo against the Republic of Iran. Despite repeated calls by the General Assembly to all states to refrain from promulgating and applying laws and measures contrary to the purposes and principles of international law, including the UN Charter, and despite the call to respect the sovereignty of states, non-intervention, non-interference, and freedom of international trade and navigation, Cuba is still subject to an illegitimate and immoral embargo that violates its inalienable rights to development. Mr. President, the Islamic Republic of Iran categorically opposes the application of any unilateral restrictive measures against sovereign state member of the United Nations, and would like to reiterate its position that imposition of such measures runs contrary to the goals and principles enshrined in the UN Charter. Further, the extraterritorial extension of those restrictive measures is in direct violation of legitimate right of other states to fully cooperate with Havana. Iran has been the target of the United States' unlawful and inhuman sanctions since 1979. In the past 4 decades, the rate of unilateral coercive measures imposed on the Iranian people has exponentially increased to the extent that U.S. has even targeted the import of the medication and medical equipment. In addition to reimposition, this unilateral illegal sanction against Iran, in gross violation of its obligation under the UN Charter, as well as the Security Council Resolution 2231/2015, the U.S. brazenly continue to threaten other states to either violate the said resolution or face punishment. The response to the unilateralism lies in heightened solidarity and taken greater collective action. Iran will continue working with its partners to create a new environment in which self-respecting nations can pursue their own interests and fulfill their international obligations. We will continue to work to offset unlawful U.S. sanctions and irreversibly eliminate the stabilizing phenomenon of extraterritorial application of its domestic legislation. The world must find solutions to counter such destructive intervention and unilateralism. Mr. President, since 1992, when Cuba first introduced this draft resolution to the General Assembly, the support of people all around the world for the legitimate claims of the Cuban people has been continuously growing. In this regard, my country once again expresses its unwavering solidarity with the people and the governments of Cuba and join the global call on the United States to immediately and fully comply with its international obligations as well as to alleviate the application and enforcement of unilateral coercive measures. I thank you.
I should like to thank the distinguished representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran, and I now invite the distinguished representative of Congo to take the floor.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President. Congo aligns itself with the statement made by the representative of Uganda on behalf of G77 and China, as well as that made by Zambia on behalf of the African group. We wish to make a number of comments in our national capacity. Mr. President, at the outset, allow me to recall the remarks made from this very rostrum by Ambassador Hidalgo Basulto, former permanent representative of Cuba, shortly before the adoption of the first resolution on the necessity of ending the economic, commercial, and financial embargo imposed by the United States of America against Cuba on the 24th of November 1992. He said, "The embargo is the most serious of the myriad forms of aggression perpetrated against Cuba by the government of the United States. The embargo is immoral and unethical. It is an act which strives systematically to reduce an entire people to hardship and famine, in flagrant violation of their human, political, and social rights." Almost 31 years later, such remarks still apply as we consider Agenda Item 38 of the 78th regular session of the General Assembly. It is devoted to considering this embargo. Mr. President, it is vital that the interminable embargo imposed on Cuba by the United States of America be lifted. It has been in place since the middle of last century, and it needs to be lifted, as was recognized by the Secretary General himself in the report A/78/84 that my delegation welcomes. Indeed, this report states that the continued presence of the financial and commercial embargo imposed on Cuba by the United States of America, which has now been enforced for 60 years, and Cuba's placement on the list of states that sponsor terrorism are both incompatible with an international system based on the rule of law, and both acts are a clear expression of the wielding of political and economic clout, which gravely undermines human rights, including the right to development. The harmful effects of these measures are as patently clear as they are unacceptable under the United Nations Charter and under principles of international law. Moreover, in addition to the effects aforementioned, the embargo is affecting the crisis following the COVID-19 pandemic and is exacerbating current economic, financial, and climate crises. And all of these are placing the well-being of the Cuban people under additional strain. Mr. President, Congo reiterates its desire to promote stringent adherence to the purposes and principles enshrined in the United Nations Charter. We call once again for the unconditional lifting of the economic, commercial, and financial embargo imposed on Cuba by the United States of America. I thank you.
I should like to thank the distinguished representative of the Congo, and I now call on the distinguished representative of Jamaica to take the floor.
Mr. President, let me first express my delegation's warm welcome and best wishes to His Excellency Mr. Bruno Rodriguez Padilla, Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Cuba. Jamaica aligns itself with the statements delivered by St. Lucia on behalf of the Caribbean community and by Uganda on behalf of G77 and China on the necessity of ending the economic, commercial, and financial embargo imposed by the United States of America against Cuba. My delegation thanks the Secretary General of the United Nations for his regular reports on this important issue and for maintaining a forum for UN member states to articulate their perspectives on this unilateral policy, which Jamaica continues to believe is in violation of international law and contrary to the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter. Jamaica values the significance of participating in the discussions under this important agenda item and continues to join the international community in expressing its unwavering solidarity with the government and people of the Republic of Cuba on this call for the removal of this irrelevant and decades-old blockade on Cuba. The embargo has not only inflicted unnecessary wounds to the Cuban economy, but also stifles the development aspirations and the growth potential of the Cuban people. Mr. President, Jamaica considers this prolonged blockade against Cuba to be contrary to the norms and ethos governing friendly relations among states, international trade, and navigation. It continues to be the main obstacle to the prosperity and to the realization of the genuine aspirations of the Cuban people. This blockade has hindered progress on Cuba's national plan for economic and social development and impeded Cuba's implementation of Agenda 2030 and her attainment of the Sustainable Development Goals. The embargo has frustrated efforts by the government of Cuba to contribute to the global fight against climate change, transnational crime, and poverty. It has also hampered initiatives aimed at women's empowerment, social protection for the most vulnerable, and transformation of the economy and society in a constantly changing global environment. The embargo against Cuba has stymied economic, commercial, and financial activities, thereby hindering regular access to bilateral trade, importation of goods, and access to financial mechanisms through formal and institutional channels. The embargo has deterred Cuba's effective response to exogenous shocks, including the impact of health emergencies such as the COVID-19 pandemic, natural disasters, and global food, energy, and health crises. Such crises have had significant negative and lasting effects on women, children, the elderly, people with disabilities, and vulnerable groups in Cuba. The unmerited inclusion of Cuba on the United States list of state sponsors of terrorism further restricts entities from conducting legitimate business with Cuba and deepens the challenges for third states' engagement with Cuba on trade, investment, developmental aid, and international cooperation on transnational organized crime and provision of technical assistance. Therefore, we continue to express our concerns about the impact of continuing the blockade and the grave systemic implications of the extraterritorial application of the United States of America laws regulating transactions, directly or indirectly. For far too long, the people of Cuba have suffered in an unjustified and undignified manner as a result of this embargo. The undue hardship imposed has impacted and affected every facet of life and livelihood of the Cuban people. Mr. President, the international community has been seized of this matter since the first tabling of this resolution at the 46th session of the United Nations General Assembly in 1991. Every year since 1992, the international community has consistently, profoundly, and resoundingly expressed support, as is evidenced in the favorable voting outcomes for the need to end this blockade against Cuba. As a peaceful member and development advocate within the international community, Jamaica welcomed the re-establishment of diplomatic relations between Cuba and the United States in 2015, which has served to ease restrictions in a number of areas. But notwithstanding this positive step in the right direction, we have seen reversals in the more recent past. In any event, even those measures were not far-reaching enough and cannot be a substitute for the lifting of the embargo to allow the Cuban people's access to critical financial resources, health products and services, inputs for industrial activities, and importantly, their right to development. Mr. President, I will close by reiterating Jamaica's calls for advancing dialogue between Cuba and the United States. Jamaica reaffirms its commitment to stand in solidarity with the government and people of Cuba in concerted efforts with the majority of the members of the United Nations, and call for the removal of the embargo and for the full inclusion of the Republic of Cuba in the international community. The benefits and cycle of international development cooperation are upended as long as a member of the international community is unreasonably deprived of opportunities to contribute to our collective vision of a safe, just, sustainable, prosperous, and progressive world. Jamaica will therefore vote in favor of the resolution. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Jamaica for his statement, and I now invite the distinguished representative of Egypt to take the floor.
Mr. President, distinguished delegates, member states, I would like to align my country with a statement delivered by Uganda on behalf of the Group of 77 and China, the statement delivered by Zambia on behalf of the African Group, as well as the statement delivered by Azerbaijan on behalf of the Non-Aligned Movement, and the statement of Mauritania on behalf of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. I would like to thank His Excellency, the Secretary General, for his report on the importance of the necessity of ending the economic, commercial, and financial embargo imposed by the United States of America against Cuba. I would like to reaffirm the steadfast position of Cuba in support of the people and government of Cuba. The unilateral coercive measures and the embargo affect negatively and in a very direct manner very vital sectors of the economy. These measures have very profound repercussions on the economic and social life of the Cuban people. They have a difficulty to access food, medicine, education, and advanced technology. In this regard, Egypt reiterates the importance of respecting and upholding the principles and objectives of the Charter of the UN, as well as the international law, and we call for the respect of the many resolutions of the General Assembly in this regard. We repeat that the continuity of this embargo is not going to discourage the international community, which will keep calling for lifting those measures. In conclusion, we call upon the international community and encourage for the complete lifting of the sanctions immediately and enable the Cuban people to achieve the objectives of the sustainable development.
Representative of Egypt for his statement, and I now invite the distinguished representative of the Philippines to take the floor.
Mr. President, the Philippines aligns itself with the statements delivered by Singapore on behalf of ASEAN, by Azerbaijan on behalf of the Non-Aligned Movement, and by Uganda on behalf of the Group of 77 and China. For the 31st year, we are witnessing today clear expressions of solidarity with the Cuban people through an overwhelming support for the resolution on the necessity of ending the economic, commercial, and financial embargo imposed by the United States of America against Cuba. The report of the Secretary General clearly shows that the international community once again supports strongly an end to the six-decade embargo and unjust and unjustified sanctions policy. It is also the 31st consecutive year that the Philippines will support the resolution. Mr. President, the blockade presents a main obstacle for Cuba's socio-economic development, as observed by various UN agencies in the Secretary General's report. It also poses a serious challenge for Cuba's implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. It violates international law. It is contrary to the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter. With cultural and economic ties dating as far back as the Manila-Acapulco galleon trade in the early 16th century, Cuba and its people will always have the support of the Philippines. The United States should lift the embargo against Cuba unconditionally, once and for all. Thank you, Mr. President.
I should like to thank the distinguished representative of the Philippines, and I now offer the floor to the distinguished representative of Pakistan.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. At the outset, let me acknowledge the presence of His Excellency, Mr. Bruno Eduardo Rodriguez Parilla, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Cuba. My delegation aligns itself with the statement delivered on behalf of the Non-Aligned Movement and the Group of 77 in China. Pakistan has an abiding faith in multilateralism. We believe in the fundamental principles of sovereign equality, non-interference, and non-intervention, as enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations. We consider that the imposition of unilateral economic measures is counterproductive and inconsistent with the purposes and principles of the Charter of the United Nations and international law. Both the Human Rights Council and the General Assembly recognize that people should not be deprived of their own means of subsistence, especially food and medicine. They also recognize that the extraterritorial application of law, including unilateral coercive measures that affect international humanitarian law and international human rights law, is inadmissible. Such measures are also in contravention of our pledge in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development to leave no one behind. The economic, financial, and commercial embargo severely impacts the lives of all Cuban citizens. In that regard, we also take note of the report of the Secretary General, which raises similar concerns. Ending the embargo would be a significant step towards ameliorating the quality of life of the Cuban people. I thank you very much.
I should like to thank the distinguished representative of Pakistan for his statement, and I now invite the distinguished representative of Gabon to take the floor.
Mr. President, I would like to thank you for the leadership that you are demonstrating in the work of this General Assembly, and you enjoy the support of my country. My country aligns itself with the statements made by Uganda on behalf of the G77 and China, and that made by Zambia on behalf of the African group, and also with the statements made by the other groups to which we are a member. Mr. President, Gabon is continuing to be concerned at the continuing commercial, economic, and financial embargo imposed upon Cuba by the United States of America. The scale of its impact is more and more harmful to the Cuban people. This economic blockade, which has been going on for more than 61 years, is clearly a hostile act to regional and continental cohesion, and it threatens the pacific coexistence between states. These measures go against international law, the United Nations Charter, and the norms and principles that govern the peaceful relations between states. The embargo against Cuba prevents the economic, cultural and social development of the island, and it has negative impact on many sensitive sectors such as public health, and it affects the well-being of the Cuban people, and it imposes on these people unacceptable suffering. This embargo is the main obstacle to the social and economic development of Cuba and to the implementation of its national development plan, including the development program for 2030. Gabon reasserts its appeal for the full implementation of United Nations resolutions in favor of the lifting of the economic, commercial and financial embargo that has been imposed upon Cuba by the United States of America. In the same spirit, Gabon calls upon the international community to continue in its efforts to normalize the relations between the two countries. We are convinced that only the principles of dialogue, cooperation and solidarity will contribute to establishing a climate of trust and peace and will promote significant progress on this issue. Mr. President, we reiterate our appeal for unconditional lifting of the economic, financial and commercial embargo imposed upon Cuba, and we will support the draft resolution we have before us. Thank you very much.
I should like to thank the distinguished representative of Gabon for his statement, as indeed for his sentiments, and I now wish to offer the floor to the plurinational state of Bolivia for their statement.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Allow me to thank the Presidency for convening this meeting, which is of interest to the entire international community. We welcome to this meeting the Minister for Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Cuba, Bruno Rodriguez Barria, and we welcome the presence of the entire delegation. Bolivia aligns itself with the statements made by Uganda on behalf of G77 and China, by Azerbaijan on behalf of the Non-Aligned Movement, by St. Vincent and the Grenadines on behalf of the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, and by Eritrea on behalf of the Group of Friends in Defense of the United Nations Charter. We wish to make the following comments in our national capacity. President, Excellencies, colleagues, allow me at the outset to thank the sister Republic of Cuba for their unwavering solidarity to the most noble causes of humankind. Its health, education, and humanitarian aid brigades have been selfless and have been deployed across the globe. The peoples of the world have witnessed how 60 years have not been enough to punish a people united in solidarity. Moreover, we're seeing the ratcheting up of the economic, commercial, and financial embargo imposed by the United States of America. Just think how many lives could have been saved if Cuba had had the freedom and the opportunity to share with the rest of the world the vaccines which were successfully developed in Cuban laboratories. Mr. President, myriad reports from specialized agencies and the report of the Secretary General demonstrates that the embargo has been the greatest impediment to Cuba's achievement of the SDGs. Moreover, the report confirms the international consensus that exists around the need to put an end to this economic, commercial, and financial embargo which has been illegitimately and illegally imposed against Cuba. However, in spite of this international consensus and in spite of the support of the overwhelming majority of this General Assembly, the aggressor country prefers to ignore and flout the decisions and resolutions adopted year after year. This is one more demonstration of the double standards of certain states. While some countries comply with and uphold international law and multilateralism, Others treat this General Assembly in a disgraceful way. Mr. President, it is inconceivable and contradictory that the most solidarity-driven country in the world be included unilaterally and outside the perimeters of international law on the list of state sponsors of terrorism drawn up by the United States. This is a flagrant aggression against the Cuban people, an act whose only goal is to create further suffering through unjust and inhumane sanctions. There is no valid argument for Cuba's placement on this list. As such, the plurinational state of Bolivia demands Cuba's immediate removal from this list. That will rectify a historic mistake and serve to remedy perhaps irreparable damage against the Cuban people. President, Bolivia is a country which seeks sisterly relations and cooperation between peoples and governments with a view to contributing to mutual understanding, comprehensive equitable development, the promotion of intercultural coexistence, and all of this with full respect for the sovereignty of peoples and the independence of states. It is precisely for this reason that we roundly condemn and reject the implementation of any policy based on interference or interventionism, and we impose the application of any unilateral coercive measures which violate the sovereignty, independence, or territorial integrity of any states. With this in mind, my country intends to deepen its cooperation with Cuba and other countries of the world to strengthen sustainable development in all its facets. As part of that policy, the Bolivia's national airline and the strategic public business that is Bolivian Aviation has this week inaugurated commercial flights, direct commercial flights indeed, between Santa Cruz in Bolivia and Havana, Cuba, to promote trade, integration, and cultural exchange between our peoples. Finally, Mr. President, for the aforementioned reasons, Bolivia supports the resolution that will be adopted today. That will add to more than 30 resolutions that have not yet succeeded in putting an end to the ongoing act of aggression that the brave Cuban people has weathered. We reaffirm our commitment to continue to work to ensure that sooner rather than later this aggression against Cuba is put to an end, because nothing weakens multilateralism more than the fact that a state is able to violate with impunity the human rights of an entire people. That act is grounded in military and economic might. Peoples will never be vanquished when the causes that they fight for are justice, the defense of life, and the defense of dignity. Thank you, Mr. President.
I should like to thank the distinguished representative of Bolivia, and I now invite the distinguished representative of Nicaragua to take the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. We align ourselves with the statements made by the representatives of Cuba on behalf of the G77 and China, Azerbaijan on behalf of the Non-Aligned Movement, and San Vincent and the Grenadines on behalf of the Community of Latin American States, El Salvador on behalf of the Central American integration system, and that made by Venezuela on behalf of the Group of Friends in Defense of the United Nations Charter. We recognize and we thank the Foreign Minister of Cuba for being with us, Brother Bruno Rodriguez. The imperialist powers continue to maintain and worsening the unilateral, illegal, coercive, and arbitrary policy against sovereign peoples and governments, imposing their hegemonic interests over the priorities of the international community. They foment wars, blockades, sanctions, and defamatory campaigns. These are contrary to international law, to the United Nations Charter, and the most basic principles that should guide the relations of mutual respect, solidarity, dialogue, and cooperation between states. The peoples of the entire world have the right to exercise our national sovereignty, our independence, moving forward in building and developing our own model of political economic, social, and cultural development, free from any interventions, threats, or aggressions from abroad. In the face of these perverse practices, our developing people are moving towards multipolarity, confronting the destructive imperialism and neocolonialism, which tries to dominate the planet and humanity. And thus it is that humanity is creating the conditions to put an end to the imperial hegemony. And in this spirit, with its own voice, with its own identity, dignity, and shared values, the international community should move forward to better integration, rejecting and denouncing all remnants of colonialism. We are referring to the criminal, economic, commercial, and financial embargo which has been imposed for more than 60 years on the Brotherhood Republic of Cuba, and its unjustified inclusion in the list of state sponsors of terrorism, and it should be removed from that list. The U.S. hegemony has imposed on the heroic people of Cuba an illegal blockade. This heroic revolutionary brother has resisted for more than 60 decades and is continuing to resist to this corrosive blockade which violates its state institutions, limits its access to financing for development, weakens its economy, and affects the full enjoyment of all fundamental rights of an entire people. Nicaragua, along with all developing countries, the international community as a whole, rejects these illegal, unilateral coercive measures and this dangerous and stifling blockade. Nicaragua condemns all the hostile policies imposed by the United States of America against Cuba, and the tracking down of financial transactions and commercial transactions, and the impossibility to issue non-immigrant visas in Havana, intimidation against companies that provides fuel to the island, and the attempts to frustrate recovery of the tourist sector following the COVID-19 pandemic, and the campaign to discredit programs of medical cooperation of Cuba, just to mention a few. Cuba has demonstrated that since the 1st of March 2022 to the 28th of February 2023, the blockade has caused damage to Cuba, estimated to be $4.8 billion. This represents an impact of more than $505 million per month, more than $13 million a day, and more than $550,000 every hour of this blockade. The accumulated damage over six decades of this policy has reached $150,084.3 million. But even so, in the worst circumstances and the most criminal pressure, Cuba has been able to overcome the severe COVID-19 pandemic with its own efforts and talents. It is admirable that Cuba, thanks to its awareness and its fighting revolutionary spirit and its socialist conviction and commitment with the world, and its unequaled example of international solidarity, has supported 42 countries and territories in the pandemic since the COVID-19 pandemic was declared in May of 2020 until September 2022. 58 Henry Reed specialized Cuban brigades worked, and their members joined more than 28,000 Cuban health professionals who have been working in 6 nations as part of the cooperation medical brigades sent by this brotherly country. Cuba has been able to resist and establish initiatives so that its own efforts, together with brother peoples in solidarity, can win this battle, because Cuba's battle is our battle. Cuba's victory is our victory. We also congratulate our Cuban sisters and brothers for an excellent chairmanship of the group of G77 and China. 134 countries make up this group of countries of the Global South. This is more than 2/3 of the member states of the United Nations, in which 80% of the global population lives. And indeed, at the recent summit of the G77 in China, held in Havana, showed that they have not been able to kill these imperialists and colonialists of the world, have not been able to kill the fighting spirit and the dignity of the peoples of the world. Mr. President, the universal consensus of the peoples and government of the world has demanded an end to this inhuman, illegal and criminal blockade, which is cruel and genocidal in nature. It violates the human rights of an entire people, undermining the efforts of the courageous Cuban people to implement their national plan of economic and social development for 2030, as well as achieving the 2030 Agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals. The government of the United States, by failing to implement the 30 resolutions of the General Assembly, demonstrates its disrespect for international law, the United Nations Charter, and the political will of the universal consensus of the international community, which demands an end to this outdated policy against Cuba. The clear objective of the empire has been to destroy Cuba, to destroy the socialist model, which is fair, based on solidarity with its people and with the peoples of the world. The United States should begin a respectful dialogue to resolve the bilateral issues outstanding with Cuba on the basis of the equality of states, reciprocity, respect for the sovereignty and independence of Cuba. Mr. President, we are fully convinced that international solidarity with Cuba will continue to be effective, and that the General Assembly will condemn today, once again, this criminal embargo and all the extraterritorial measures which are being implemented against the dear people of Cuba. We hope that once again there will be the end of the double standards in this General Assembly, and that there will be respect for and implementation of the various UN resolutions on this issue, that we put an end to this inhuman blockade against Cuba. Nicaragua, as in previous years, will vote in favor of Draft Resolution A78/L5, and today this General Assembly will approve universally this resolution submitted by Cuba, and in that way will be defending multilateralism, the United Nations Charter, seeking to find understanding, peaceful coexistence between nations, and promoting a culture of peace that we all talk about and desire. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
I should like to thank the distinguished representative of Nicaragua for his statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Bruno Eduardo Rodriguez Parilla, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Cuba, to introduce the draft resolution A/78/L5.
Señor Presidente.
Mr. President, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, the embargo violates the right to life, the right to health, the right to education, and the well-being of all Cuban men and women. Our families feel the effects of this blockade through the fact shops are lacking goods and there are long queues. There are excessively high prices and salaries are devalued. These are all effects of the blockade. The government makes great efforts to guarantee that all are provided with the basic family food basket of rations. That scarcely satisfies all needs, but it does meet those crucial to the survival of all households. All receive this basket without any exception at heavily subsidized prices. This year, to cover the cost of that basket, the government will need to invest more than $1.6 billion, with only 1/3 of the value of the losses caused by the embargo between March 2022 and February 2023. These expenses would have been amply covered. The blockade deprives our national industry of the funds required to procure agricultural machinery, animal fodder, parts and spare parts for equipment and the industry as a whole, as well as other inputs necessary for food production, which is being severely compromised. Under strict licenses, Cuba is allowed to commercially procure products in the agricultural products in the United States, but this is subject to draconian and discriminatory limitations that violate the universally accepted rules of international trade, as well as the freedom of travel and navigation. Cuba is forced to buy those products by paying for them in advance and by shipping them on board of vessels belonging to that nation, which are required to return empty to their ports of origin. While across the world, trade is a two-way operation. It flows in two directions. Cuba is prevented from exporting to the United States and cannot access credit, be these from private institutions or granted by multilateral financial institutions. Cuban families suffer blackouts, which at times have been overwhelming. Where the energy and mining sector is concerned, the damage over the last year exceed $491 million. The primary source of those losses lies in the national electricity sector. They have weathered more than 200 million in losses. With that money, we could have guaranteed the supplies and the vital spare parts to avoid blackouts and guarantee the functioning of our electric industry and our power plants. Sick people, including children, elder persons, pregnant women, are damaged by the lack or choppy supply of medicines and doctors. They are deprived from chemotherapy and treatment for heart disease, and people face difficulties on a daily basis to acquire in time insulin, antibiotics, painkillers, hypertensive medication, and other primary medications. Our country is able to produce more than 60% of its core medications. These levels of production have not been able to be guaranteed during this period in which we've seen the blockade ratcheted up because of the cunning blow dealt to our finance sector. Cuba is prevented from buying from U.S. companies and their subsidiaries in third countries equipment, technologies, medical devices, and end-use pharmaceuticals. Therefore, our country is forced to acquire them at exorbitant prices by way of intermediaries or to replace them with less effective generic drugs, and this is even true for newborns and sick children. With the consent from the family duly obtained, I will now share with you, with deep sorrow, the situation facing Maria, a Cuban girl of only 6 years old. She had to undergo surgery for the partial removal of an intracranial grade 4 tumor. She has received the alternative chemotherapy treatment required to shrink the tumor, but it was impossible to treat her with lomustine, a U.S. manufactured drug which Cuba cannot access due to the blockade. This and other medications are first-line treatments for these high-grade tumors and treat tumors that affect the central nervous system, but lomustine is the most effective treatment among them, and Cuba cannot access it. Right now, this young patient is in relapse and is now being subject to a so-called rescue chemotherapy treatment. For her, as for other Cuban children, the blockade continues to mark the difference between life and death. Yadier and Abel are two 14-year-old teenagers. They suffer from cerebral palsy. This condition causes spasticity that impairs their motor function and causes involuntary movements which they cannot control, and that makes their everyday life difficult. The dedication of their teachers and of the other professionals who have supported them over all these years has allowed these teenagers to recover their motor, intellectual, and communication skills as far as possible, and they have been fully integrated into society. However, how different could the lives of Yadier and Abil have been if Cuba were not prevented from directly acquiring on the US market the type A botulinum toxin, an injectable drug that would prevent their spasms? It has encouraging results in this type of patients. As occurs in many other similar cases, these teenagers became direct victims of the merciless harassment of Cuba. The US government is lying when it asserts that the blockade does not prevent access to medicines or medical equipment. At the most difficult points of the COVID-19 pandemic, when cases peaked and our intensive care units were overcrowded and exceeding capacity, Cuba was not allowed to import ventilators on the pretext that European companies supplying those machines were subsidiaries of US companies. That fact is without a doubt a cruel and inhumane act and a gross violation of the rules of commerce and international law. Cuba, therefore, had to develop its national production of ventilators using prototypes it itself had developed. The extreme cruelty of the blockade was laid brutally bare when our main medical oxygen plant went out of order, when the number of COVID-19 cases in our country was peaking. The two US companies tried to supply medical oxygen to Cuba, and that demonstrated that there was the need for the US government to grant a special license for that transaction, even during the pandemic. Cuba also has evidence proving the machinations of the US government designed to prevent companies of two Latin American countries from selling medical oxygen to our country. The blockade created difficulties with and delayed the import and arrival in Cuba of other inputs and medical equipment vital to tackle the COVID-19 virus, and vital particularly for scaling up the production of Cuban vaccines. During the pandemic, the US government applied temporary humanitarian exemptions to countries that are victims of its unilateral coercive measures and other sanctions. I ask you now, why was Cuba excluded from that temporary humanitarian relief? The truth is that the US government opportunistically used used COVID-19 as an ally in its hostile policy against Cuba. The blockade indeed constitutes a crime of genocide in accordance with the Convention for the Prevention and Punishment of this offence, as clearly established under Articles 2b and c. The wicked decision to ratchet up the blockade to unprecedented levels at that particular time during the pandemic and to take advantage of the global economic crisis resulting from the pandemic to promote destabilization in the country clearly reveals the profoundly cruel and inhumane nature of that policy. The feat of saving and preserving the lives of our compatriots under such difficult circumstances was only made possible by the efforts deployed by the government and all of our people over decades to build a robust health and science system. This system is profoundly humanist in vocation. It's high quality and accessible to all Cuban men and women at no cost. Despite the fact that caring for human beings has been and will continue to be the highest priority of the Cuban government, it cannot be denied that the blockade is having a huge impact on the quality of life and services offered to the people. Mr. President, for more than 6 decades, Cuba has resisted a ruthless economic, commercial, and financial blockade. More than 80% of our current population has known nothing other than a Cuba under blockade. The U.S. government has not let up in its efforts to deprive our country from the crucial financial revenues they require. They have not ceased to lower the living standards of our people or to impose a continued shortage of foodstuff, medicines, and other basic inputs. They have not let up in efforts to bring about an economic collapse. Viciously and with surgical precision, the U.S. government is attacking the most delicate sectors of the economy. It deliberately intends to inflict the greatest possible damage on Cuban families. The blockade is an act of economic warfare in times of peace. It aims to lay waste to the government's capacity to meet the needs of its people. It aims to create a situation of ungovernability and to destroy the constitutional order. These objectives were clearly described in the infamous memorandum written by the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State Lester Mallory on April 6, 1960. That memorandum was declassified several years later. Now I quote, "Every possible means should be undertaken promptly to weaken the economic life of Cuba, denying money and supplies to Cuba, to decrease monetary and real wages, to bring about hunger, desperation, and to overthrow the government." End quote. That is the nature of, and those are the goals pursued by the economic coercion and maximum pressure policy being implemented by the current U.S. administration against Cuba. Those have been its goals since the very beginning. The conduct of the United States is absolutely unilateral and unjustified. There is no single measure or action being taken by our country to damage the United States or to harm its powerful economy or its commercial activity. There is not one action being taken by Cuba which jeopardizes the independence of the United States or its national security. There's no single action being taken by Cuba which undermines its sovereign rights, which seeks to interfere in its internal affairs, or which aims to damage the well-being of its citizens. It is neither legal nor ethical for the government of a major power to subject a small nation for decades to ceaseless economic warfare in the interest of imposing a political system on it which is alien to it, and to once again take hold of its resources. It is unacceptable to deprive an entire people of the right to peace, self-determination, development, and human progress. The Cuban people is not the only people suffering the terrible consequences of an illegal, cruel, and inhumane policy. There are many others in this world who are also the victims of this injustice and of the philosophy of dispossession, which leads to the philosophy of war, as was denounced by our Commander-in-Chief, Fidel Castro Ruiz, from this rostrum in 1960. At this tragic juncture, I reiterate Cuba's full support for and solidarity with the brotherly people of Palestine, currently being massacred on their own illegally occupied land. These barbaric acts must stop. The U.S. authorities have tried to sow the idea that the Cuban government is ineffective and that our system is failing. They have cynically claimed that they support the Cuban people, and they intend to make others believe that the unilateral coercive measures that they impose do not affect families. They intend to make people believe that they're not a significant factor in the difficulties faced by Cuba's national economy. It is clear that the blockade is not responsible for all the problems today facing our country. That has been stated by President Miguel Díaz-Canel. But anyone denying its very serious effects or failing to recognize that it is the main cause of the deprivation, scarcity, and hardships suffered by the Cuban families would be failing to tell the truth. Those who deny that the blockade is a massive, flagrant, and systematic violation of the human rights of our people, as well as the biggest obstacle to our development, would be lying. Let us look at facts and review some data. Between March 1st, 2022 and February 28th this year, the damage caused by the blockade have been estimated by conservative calculations to stand at $4.867 billion. That figure accounts for damages that are higher than $405 million a month, and that equates to more than $13 million in loss a day. Had the blockade not existed, Cuba's GDP would have grown by 9% in 2022. At current prices, the accumulated effects of the blockade after more than 60 years now surpass $159 billion. If we base these calculations on the value of gold, the figure amounts to some $1,337 billion. These are figures extraordinary for any economy in the world, and even more extraordinary for a small island developing nation such as ours. What would Cuba be like today if it had been able to use these resources?
As of the second half of 2019, the U.S. government has strengthened the siege around our country to an extreme measure. It's more perverse and harmful. It's adopted wartime measures to try to prevent fuel supplies from arriving in Cuba. It strengthened the attacks against Cuba's international medical cooperation. It's increased the persecution of Cuba's commercial and financial transactions in other markets, and it's tried to threaten investors and commercial entities in the third countries with the extraterritorial implementation of Title III of the Helms-Burton Act. There is also a list of Cuban restricted entities which affect most of our companies. And curiously, there's a list of prohibited accommodations among many other prohibitions and restrictions. In a globalized international economy, it's not just absurd, but it's also criminal to continue to prohibit the export to Cuba of articles manufactured in any country containing at least 10% of U.S. components, and also to prevent the import into the United States of products manufactured in third countries if they contain some raw materials, intangible or components that come from Cuba. What would have happened to other economies, including in rich countries, if they had been subjected to similar conditions? Mr. President, the United States is strengthening its mechanisms to harass Cuba in the banking and financial sectors. It maintains the prohibition to use American dollars and the ceaseless and obsessive tracking of financial and commercial transactions in other currencies in areas such as trade and investments. The persecution has been further strengthened after the arbitrary inclusion of Cuba in the State Department's unilateral list of countries that allegedly sponsor terrorism. This was a lethal measure imposed by the former Republican administration only 9 days before leaving the White House. The current president could have amended that just tomorrow with a signature. The U.S. government is lying and is severely hampering international efforts to combat terrorism when it accuses Cuba, without any grounds for doing so, of being a country that sponsors that scourge. There isn't a single valid or reasonable argument to keep Cuba on that spurious list. It's an inadmissible action against a specific nation that has been itself a victim of terrorism and that is still suffering today the incitement to violence and terrorist acts from the U.S. territory, and whose behavior of firmly rejecting and persecuting all forms of manifestations of terrorism is impeccable and should be recognized. The effects of this are particularly harmful in the context of a global economy that is becoming more and more interconnected, interdependent, and, more than anything else, subject to the dictates of the powerful financial centers that are controlled by Washington. Based on this arbitrary accusation, the U.S. authorities are extorting hundreds of banking and financial entities all over the world, and they force them to make the choice between continuing to maintain relations with the United States or maintaining their relations with Cuba. Between January 2021 and February 2023, there was a total of 909 actions reported by foreign banks that had refused to offer their services to our country. Dozens of Cuban diplomatic missions abroad have lost contact with their traditional banks, and currently they do not have any bank account, nor do they enjoy any financial services. This has occurred even in countries that developed friendly and cooperative relations with our country, and which have consistently rejected the economic blockade, but have become victims of the extraterritorial power of U.S. hostility, its harmful and disproportionate influence on the international financial system, and its determination to undermine the Cuban economy. Falsely qualifying Cuba in this way, which says that it's a so-called risk, is forcing Cuba to pay as much as twice the cost of any commodity on the world market. Cuban entrepreneurs, whom the United States cynically claims to support, are often denied access to platforms of e-commerce and payment platforms, including PayPal and Airbnb. They are not even allowed to open personal bank accounts just for being Cuban. In third countries, they have met banking restrictions and have suffered discrimination as a result of the effects of the blockade. Not even academic, scientific training escapes the effects of this absurd policy. Evelio is a 25-year-old Cuban youth. He's currently studying information science engineering. With the support of his university, he was ready to share with students from other countries the results of his scientific research, and he decided to attend in person the World Congress on Undergraduate Research. This is an international scientific event, and it was held from the 4th to the 6th of April of 2023 at the University of Warwick in the UK. He was admitted as a participant due to the quality of his research. However, shortly afterwards, the organizers of the event informed him that given Cuba's inclusion in the list of countries under sanctions, the funding for his in-person attendance would be withdrawn. He hoped to see an end to the blockade because, as is the case with thousands of other Cuban youths, this policy excludes and discriminates him, and they prevent them from interacting on an equal footing in academic and scientific communities. Athletes and artists from Cuba who suffer from discrimination and sometimes abuse should receive the same income that go along with their medals and prizes. Mr. President, the blockade restricts the rights of Cubans residing in the United States. It hampers family reunification by means of regular mechanisms and visas. It does not allow traveling visas to be granted in Cuba and hinders the sending of remittances. It also provokes uncertainty when people are seeking personal development in other countries, including the families of young people who are highly qualified. However, the increase of Cuban migration, with its painful cost for families and adverse demographic and economic consequences for our nation, is directly linked to the tightening of the blockade, and also with the privileged treatment given for purely political reasons to Cuban migrants who arrive on the U.S. borders, regardless of how they reach that border. It's impossible to understand the nature of the migratory flows of Cuban citizens in countries of the region heading for the United States without considering the importance of these factors which are being used for the purpose of destabilization, brain drain, and bringing about discredit for Cuba. Its unfavorable impact on some countries in our area is also clear when we see that the Cuban migrants are considered as irregular migrants and use unsafe and dangerous routes or become victims of organized crime. Cuba will also always advocate for a regular, safe, and orderly migration. It is up to your government, the U.S. government, to modify the structural causes of much of Cuban migration, whether it be regular or irregular. However, the blockade hampers the U.S. citizens' freedom to travel to Cuba. It interferes with their right to freedom of information and to form their own opinion. It also discriminates against, intimidates, and deprives the automated visa system, known as ESTA, to citizens from other countries who enjoy that privilege simply because they had visited Cuba. Mr. President, the tightening economic siege has been accompanied by a sustained communication and information media campaign against Cuba. New information technologies and other digital platforms are being used to try to capitalize on the shortages caused by the blockade and portray an absolutely false image of the reality in Cuba. And it's seeking to destabilize and discredit the country. The media crusade, particularly from toxic platforms funded and based in the U.S. territory, is aimed at encouraging discontent, creating the perception of a domestic political crisis, discrediting government institutions, and minimizing the huge efforts made by the country to cope with the challenges of an economy under blockade. This is a non-conventional cognitive warfare to which the United States publicly and notoriously allocates funds that are worth millions from the federal budget and also using other undercover funds. It is a perverse plan. It's incompatible with democracy, freedom, and the right to information that they supposedly advocate. Mr. President, the current United States government is ensuring the continuity of the humane policy established under the administration headed by President Donald Trump, and paradoxically has embraced that policy. In fact, they have maintained intact and imply severely the laws and regulations that support this policy, including the most hostile and inhumane. The blockade has reached extreme levels and continues to be the central element defining U.S. policy towards Cuba. The extraterritorial impact of the blockade harms the sovereignty of the countries that you all represent, distinguished delegates. It infringes upon your national legislations. It submits you to the decisions of U.S. courts. It affects the interest of your companies and sanctions your entrepreneurs and restricts the freedom of your citizens. And all this is in violation of international law. More than 6 decades have elapsed since the time when this General Assembly annually has been calling for an end to the blockade on Cuba. However, the express will of the international community is disrespected. It's unheeded by the government of the biggest economic, financial, and military power. It's unacceptable nor permissible to ignore with impunity the successive resolutions of this body, which is the most democratic and representative, the United Nations. On behalf of the Cuban people, I appreciate the statements against the blockade made by heads of state and government, as well as high dignitaries from 44 countries during the general debate of this session. 21 of those countries explicitly condemned Cuba's arbitrary inclusion in the unilateral and fraudulent list of state sponsors of terrorism. We express our appreciation and gratitude to the many delegations who expressed that position in yesterday's and this morning's sessions. I also deeply appreciate the statements of fraternal assistance from our compatriots from the broad and universal movement in solidarity with Cuba and the many friends we have in various latitudes. We are encouraged to enjoy the growing support of persons of goodwill who throughout the world are demanding that an end be placed to this blockade. Despite the hostility of the U.S. government, we will continue to build bridges with the people of the United States, as we do with all peoples of the world. We will strengthen more and more our links with Cuban émigrés residing abroad. We will soon host the 4th Nation and Immigration Conference that will contribute to strengthening the dialogue between the Cuban government and our compatriots. Mr. President, the colossal challenges that we face do not frighten us. The Cuban people will never cease in their efforts to honor, exalt, and defend their free and sovereign homeland. We will continue our efforts, which is transformative and revolutionary, seeking way outs of the siege imposed by U.S. imperialism, as well as ways to achieve towards prosperity with social justice and support the transformation of our communities and support and broaden our social programs. We will continue to guarantee the increased participation of our young people and all our citizens in the political, economic, social, and cultural processes of our nation. No other people has been forced to engage in a development project in such conditions, under such systematic and long-lasting hostility by a superpower. But Cuba will continue to renew itself. It will build a sovereign, independent, socialist, democratic, prosperous, and sustainable nation. Mr. President, Your Excellencies, distinguished delegates, in short, upon exercising your vote, you will not just be deciding a matter of vital interest for Cuba and each Cuban family. Your vote in favor of the draft resolution that has been presented will also be an expression in support of reason and justice, and it will be an act of support to the United Nations Charter and to international law. On behalf of our noble, dignified, and fraternal people who, for a long time now, decided to become masters of their own history and their future, on behalf of the millions of Cuban men and women who resist and create on a daily basis against the most cruel and long-lasting unilateral coercive measures system ever applied against any country, and which should be abolished once and for all for the good of all, I respectfully ask you to vote in favor of draft resolution A/Res/78/L5 entitled The Necessity of Ending the Economic, Commercial and Financial Embargo imposed by the United States of America against Cuba. We are better without a blockade. We are better without genocidal blockade. Let Cuba live without blockade. Thank you very much.
I should like to thank the distinguished Minister of Foreign Affairs of Cuba for his statement. We have heard the last speaker in the debate on this item. The Assembly will now take a decision on draft resolution A/78/L5 entitled Necessity of Ending the Economic, Commercial and Financial Embargo imposed by the United States of America against Cuba. A recorded vote has been requested. We shall now begin the voting. Those in favor of draft resolution A/78/L5, please signify. Those against, abstentions.
The General Assembly is now voting on draft resolution A/78/L5 entitled Necessity of Ending the Economic, Commercial and Financial Embargo imposed by the United States of America against Cuba. Will all delegations confirm that their votes are accurately reflected on the screen? The voting has been completed.
We're watching live the plenary session of the UN General Assembly as the voting is now underway on the session that is focused on the need to put an end on the U.S. embargo on Cuba. We witnessed today an overwhelming majority of the nations represented at the organism who have expressed themselves in favor of the resolution to end the unilateral embargo, and we now have the voting results. At the images, we have 187 countries who have voted in favor of lifting the U.S. embargo on Cuba. This is, of course, the result of the overwhelming majority of countries who have expressed throughout the day and yesterday as well at this UN plenary session the need to lift these coercive unilateral measures who have been imposed on the island nation for over 60 years. Let's recall we are now witnessing the vote has already been had on the need to lift the U.S. embargo on Cuba. This is a draft presented by the Cuban nation, and 187, an overwhelming majority of the countries have voted in favor of lifting the blockade, with only 2 countries voting against and 1 country abstaining from the vote. Earlier today and yesterday, representatives from worldwide nations expressed their rejection of the unilateral measures against Cuba and the Cuban people, which they deemed arbitrary and hypocritical.
Our students to study in Cuba
and sending doctors and specialists to work in our country's health centers. In addition to the health sector, we have also had in place a cooperation project in the area of youth sports, art and culture, which allows us to send our students and sports athletes for training and to study in Cuba. Mr. President, the vote we casted today in support of this draft resolution represents our great concern over the adverse effects of this embargo on the well-being of the peoples of Cuba. We are of the view that the embargo prevents the peoples of Cuba from fully enjoying their human rights, including the rights to development, as it undermines the efforts of Cuba in achieving the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Mr. President, as described in the report of the UN Secretary General on the draft resolution, the embargo has affected the full potential of Cuba to be a more active actor in international trade and development and international cooperation. In addition, we have also come to the understanding that the embargo has directly and indirectly affected the critical sectors of the Cuban economy, including public health, nutrition, agriculture, as well as investment, tourism, and banking. Therefore, Timor-Leste joins other delegations here in calling for the lifting of the embargo, which will help the peoples of Cuba to fully enjoy their human rights, including the right to development in accordance with the UN Charter and the international law. I thank you, Mr. President.
I'd like to thank Timor-Leste, and I now give the floor to the delegation of Sri Lanka.
Mr. President, thank you for giving me the floor. Sri Lanka voted in favor of the draft resolution A/78L5 entitled The Necessity of Ending the Economic, Commercial and Financial Embargo imposed by the United States of America against Cuba. In keeping with past practice, this Assembly adopted with an overwhelming majority the call to lift the blockade against Cuba. It is not difficult, Mr. President, to discern the rationale. A cursory perusal of the United Nations Secretary General's report, A78/84, provides the answers. For 30 years, the General Assembly has been calling for an end to the economic embargo that the United States has imposed on Cuba since 1962. If sanctions have only created hardships and collective suffering to a population, what justification, we ask, can there be to continue a policy of repression? Mr. President, it is said that universal coercive sanctions can have unintended consequences and negative humanitarian impacts. As clearly seen in the Cuban scenario, universal coercive sanctions harm the civilian population more than the intended targets, leading to increased poverty, unemployment, and a lack of access to essential goods and services. It is also said that sanctions can undermine diplomatic efforts and hinder dialogue, making it more difficult to find peaceful resolutions to a conflict. Mr. President, unilateral sanctions and secondary sanctions aimed at universalizing the sanctions regime have been the most difficult aspects of any sanctions regime, aimed at elevating such sanctions to one of collective sanctions. Unilateral sanctions can never achieve the same status as collective sanctions without exaggerated claims to jurisdiction. It is a fact that countries perceive the implications of sanctions regimes differently from one another. If one looks at the bigger picture carefully, unilateral sanctions have not had their desired effect. It is therefore time, we say, to re-examine the continuation of the sanctions against Cuba and withdraw them. We call on all those concerned to lift the imposition of unilateral coercive measures that are not authorized to relevant organs of the United Nations and are inconsistent with the principles of international law and the Charter of the United Nations. My delegation is of the considered view that the potential drawbacks of these sanctions outweigh the intended objectives. It must also be observed that the target entities find ways to circumvent the sanctions or find alternative allies, which renders nugatory the very purpose of imposing such sanctions. Mr. President, we must all remind ourselves of the fact that the imposition of universal coercive sanctions have been of little help and relatively ineffective in maintaining a conducive global order, improve the respect for human rights, and prevent the escalation of conflicts globally. The continued sanctions on Cuba against this backdrop appears misplaced and irrational. It is therefore time, we say, to revisit the continuation of the sanctions against Cuba with a view to their final withdrawal. I thank you, Mr. President.
I should like to thank the distinguished representative of Sri Lanka and now invite the distinguished representative of Solomon Islands to take the floor.
Mr. President, at the outset, my delegation acknowledges the presence of the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Cuba, Mr. Bruno Rodriguez Parilla, and thank the Secretary General for the report on Cuba, highlighting the impacts of the embargo on Cuba. My delegation aligns itself with the statement made by the distinguished delegate of Uganda on behalf of the Group of 77 in China. Mr. President, Solomon Islands voted in favor of the resolution as a reaffirmation of our support for Cuba and the cessation of the economic, commercial, and financial embargo on Cuba. The embargo on Cuba is not in the spirit of the United Nations and goes against the principles of the United Nations Charter. As member states, we are duty-bound to uphold the commitment to the purposes, principles, and the spirit of the Charter of the United Nations, particularly regarding the sovereign equality of states, non-intervention, non-interference in states' internal affairs, and freedom of international trade and navigation. Mr. President, the unilateral embargo on Cuba over 6 decades denies Cubans the right to trade, access to goods, critical and medical supplies, and violates Cuba's inalienable right to development. Nor does it reflect our unified aspirations to achieve the 2030 Agenda or the Sustainable Development Goals, which we collectively pledge not to leave anyone behind. Mr. President, Solomon Islands does not support the imposition of unilateral action or measures that perpetuate negative impact on the well-being of the people of another state. We therefore join the UN community in calling for the immediate removal of the embargo to restore faith in observing international law and the respect for United Nations principles. With the near unanimous support for the General Assembly on the resolution, again today, we encourage the United States to reconsider its decision on the embargo in the spirit of goodwill and engage in enhanced dialogue and constructive consultation with Cuba. Mr. President, Solomon Islands acknowledges with sincere appreciation Cuba's partnership and commitment to South-South cooperation and its contributions to the international community despite these imposed measures. As a close bilateral partner, Cuba has trained more than 100 of our medical doctors that are now saving lives around the country. We remain resolved in our stand with Cuba as we have done in the past and to the ending of the economic, commercial, and financial embargo on Cuba. I thank you, Mr. President.
I should like to thank the distinguished representative of the Solomon Islands, and I now invite the distinguished representative of Indonesia to take the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, Indonesia reiterates its opposition to the unilateral coercive measures with external effect on the sovereignty of other states and reiterates the legitimate interests of entities or persons under their jurisdiction and the freedom of trade and navigation. The prolonged imposition of the unilateral economic, commercial, and financial embargo by the United States against Cuba clearly violates the UN Charter principles of sovereignty of states, non-interference, and non-intervention. It also violates international law. In this regard, Indonesia rejects any measure aimed at further strengthening the unilateral embargo against Cuba. This includes the inclusion of Cuba in the United States list of state-sponsored terrorism, especially on the basis of inconsistent arguments and without proper evidence. Mr. President, we are at a crucial time where unilateral acts are increasing and it's becoming more unacceptable. So let me highlight a few points. First, we are at the midpoint of the 2030 agenda, with a risk that our SDG progress is being stalled by the current post-pandemic global economic uncertainty, conflicts, and climate crisis. Cuba has the right to fulfill their economic and social development, and it is intolerable to further impede this while we are collectively fighting to bring the SDG back on track and advocating to leaving no one behind. Second, the unilateral act undermines our efforts to restoring trust in multilateralism. There is nothing that speaks more than this, than a consecutive resolution which consistently and overwhelmingly receives favorable votes from the UN member every year, yet there is no significant effort to be made to address the problem. Third, humanity should always be put first, beyond any political agenda, let alone a single country's political agenda. The Secretary General's report clearly highlights the declining of life quality of the people of Cuba, particularly vulnerable groups such as children, women, and elderly people. Increasing infant mortality rate, deteriorating health system, and difficulty to access basic food and medicines, children deprived from their rights to education are unacceptable. Therefore, Indonesia urges for the immediate implementation of this resolution and continues to underline the importance of an enhanced and constructive dialogue to this aim. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Indonesia, and I give the floor to Spain on behalf of the European Union.
Muchas gracias. Thank you very much, Mr. President. I have the honor to speak on behalf of the European Union and its member states. The candidate countries, North Macedonia, Montenegro, Albania, and Bosnia and Herzegovina, and the Republic of Serbia, align themselves with this statement. I reiterate today our conviction that the economic, commercial, and financial embargo imposed by the United States on Cuba has a damaging impact on the country's economic situation and negatively affects the living standards of the Cuban people. We should not forget that external trade and foreign investment can play a crucial role in setting the country on a path towards modernization, reforms, and sustainable growth, and help it to overcome the economic hardship caused by external events, such as the COVID-19 pandemic, which continues to affect the island, or regular meteorological and climate change-related hazards. Consequently, the EU believes that lifting the embargo could make economic reforms more effective and facilitate the opening of the Cuban economy in the benefit of the Cuban people. We remain concerned about the human rights situation in Cuba, in particular following the events on the 11th and 12th of July 2021, following the severe rulings handed down by Cuban courts hitherto, as regards civil and political rights. Consequently, we reiterate our appeal to the Cuban government to fully grant its citizens internationally recognized civil, political, economic rights and freedoms, including freedom of assembly, freedom of expression, and free access to information. We call upon Cuba to release all political prisoners, to ratify the UN Covenant for Civil and Political Rights and the Covenant for Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, and we call upon Cuba to extend a standing invitation to all UN special procedures to visit Cuba. We strongly insist upon the importance of upholding the UN Charter and of respecting the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of all UN members. And we urge Cuba to stand in full solidarity with these fundamental principles and to work together to defend them. Moreover, we firmly believe that empowering civil society is vital for the promotion and protection of all human rights, and we call upon the Cuban government to open spaces for constructive and inclusive dialogue without preconditions with the full spectrum of the island's civil society. A broad spectrum of civil society, both Cuban and European, should also be involved in the implementation of the EU-Cuba Political Dialogue and Cooperation Agreement, the PDCA. The EU believes that the path to positive change in Cuba is closer engagement on all levels, government, economy, civil society, but positive change can also be brought about through people-to-people exchanges. Consequently, we welcome the measures announced by the U.S. administration last year to ease restrictions on family remittances and travel to the island, and to fully resume consular services. However, the redesignation of Cuba as a state sponsor of terrorism by the previous U.S. administration without the presentation of any new facts, and Cuba's maintenance on the list without obvious justification, the economic interests of the European Union. We have firmly and continuously opposed any such measures due to their extraterritorial application and their impact on the European Union, and this in violation of commonly accepted rules of international trade. We cannot accept such measures impeding our economic and commercial relations with Cuba. The EU strongly rejects the US's activation of Titles 3 and 4 of the Helms-Burton Act in April 2019. This activation breaches the commitments made by the US in the US-EU agreements of 1997 and 1998. We will avail ourselves of all appropriate measures to address the effects of the Helms-Burton Act, including in relation to our WTO rights and through the use of the EU blocking statute. That statute protects against the extraterritorial application of those U.S. sanctions to U.S. citizens, businesses, and NGOs operating in Cuba. Mr. President, for the European Union, international cooperation, dialogue, and closer, even critical engagement are the way to go where Cuba is concerned. The provisional application of the EU-Cuba Political Dialogue and Cooperation Agreement, the PDCA, is now in its 6th year. The agreement has put our bilateral relationship on new and solid legal footing. It sets forth an agenda of critical engagement with Cuba that will also allow us to support and accompany Cuba on its path of reform and modernization. We are enhancing dialogue and cooperation also on issues on which we still have fundamental differences. To this end, the aforementioned PDCA has established a human rights dialogue as a key pillar of our relationship. The 4th formal meeting of the dialogue is scheduled to be held on the 24th of November. Following the adoption of the country's new constitution and in order to overcome the current economic and social crisis, we call upon Cuba to ensure that its reform agenda extends economic, judicial, and social reforms, and to ensure that it is implemented in a manner that addresses the key concerns of the Cuban people. Moreover, its implementation must meet the legitimate democratic aspirations of the Cuban people for more opportunities to participate in shaping the country's future. The PDCA is an agreement that allows the EU to offer Cuba a consistent and reliable partnership to support Cuba as it seeks to reform its political and economic model, to pursue sustainable development, and to find common solutions to global challenges, while continuing to advocate democracy and for the respect of human rights in the interests of all human citizens. It is our considered view that the US embargo does not contribute to promoting these aims. On the contrary, it hinders their achievement. Against this backdrop, the member states of the European Union voted unanimously in favor of the draft resolution. Thank you.
I thank the delegation of Spain on behalf of the European Union, and I'll give the floor to the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, members of the General Assembly. The United States stands resolutely with the Cuban people. We strongly support their pursuit of a future with respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. Approximately 1,000 political prisoners remain behind bars in Cuba, more than at any point in Cuba's recent history. Nearly 700 of those detentions owe to the historic July 11, 2021 protests during which members of civil society, including human rights defenders as well as minors of age, exercised their freedom of expression and right of peaceful assembly. We share the Cuban people's dream of democracy in Cuba and join international partners in calling for the Cuban government to immediately release all those unjustly detained. Despite Cuba's membership in the UN Human Rights Council, the Cuban government has delayed responding to requests to send independent experts to Cuba who would help advance respect for human rights, including freedom of expression, freedom of religion or belief, and the freedom to assemble peacefully. Some of these requests have remained pending for 10 years. Sanctions are one set of tools in our broader effort toward Cuba to advance democracy and promote respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms in Cuba. We therefore oppose this resolution. We recognize the challenges the Cuban people face. That is why U.S. sanctions include exemptions and authorizations relating to the exports of food, medicine, and other humanitarian goods to Cuba. The United States remains a significant source of humanitarian goods to the Cuban people and one of Cuba's principal trading partners. In 2002 alone, U.S. companies exported over $295 million worth of agricultural goods to Cuba, including food, to help meet the needs of the Cuban people. The United States opposes this resolution. We encourage this body to urge the Cuban government to adhere to its human rights obligations and listen to the Cuban people and their aspirations to determine their own future. Thank you, Mr. President.
We have had the last speaker in explanation of vote after the vote. The exercise of right of reply has been requested. May I remind members that statements in exercise of the right of reply are limited to 10 minutes for the first intervention and 5 minutes to the second intervention and should be made by delegations in their seats. I call on the representative of Cuba to exercise that right.
Gracias.
Thank you, Mr. President. I use the right to reply in light of the statement made by the representative of the United States. Once again, with old and new pretexts, the government of the U.S. is trying to in vain justify a policy which is illegal and morally unsustainable, even when, in an overwhelming way, the General Assembly has confirmed over more than 3 decades an unequivocal message that the international community recognizes the urgency of putting an end to the economic and commercial embargo against Cuba. The USA is imposing the most serious siege and with the greatest impact in terms of the coercive measures undertaken against Cuba. What was announced in May 2022 with regard to visas, remittances, and travel to Cuba does not change the principal measures that enhance the blockade and which have caused a severe worsening in the living conditions of the Cuban people since 2019 till today. The speech of the United States is hypocritical and dishonest. The criminal, economic, commercial, and financial embargo against the people of Cuba is a cruel violation which is massive and been on over a long time and cannot be justified in any way, even with the lies and the calumnies and the legends that the White House and the State Department seeks to use to justify its measures. For several thousands of children over 18 years, they have been injured or harmed by measures by the U.S., and there have been several hundred shootings in schools since 1970. The systemic racism in that country, the police brutality, the repressive policy against migrants, and the repression of the reproductive rights, and extrajudicial executions and the use of torture are just some of the condemned practices committed in the United States and which are a scandal to the whole world. The United States' complicity with the massive assassination of citizens in Gaza at the hand of the IDF means that it is participating in a crime against humanity. Mr. President, the U.S. delegation cites inflated figures with regard to humanitarian aid to our country, and it talks about multi-million funds that the United Agency for International Development is sending for subversion in Cuba, and which are used to for Cuban immigrants and the beneficiaries. This is all just making many obstacles to the delivery of support from NGOs. It's totally false that the United States is providing medicine to Cuba. There is irrefutable proof that the blockade prevented the official channels for sending aid to the country, including from third countries, in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. The restrictions for the export of medicines to Cuba are explicitly covered by laws, and this is an arm of aggression, a weapon of aggression against our country. The U.S. says that it advocates individual freedoms and supports the private sector in Cuba, but it has not lifted restrictions which damage the interests of the Cuban businessmen. If the U.S. is really interested in the well-being of the human rights and the self-determination of the Cuban people, they could lift the blockade. They would work together in cooperation internationally rather than discrediting us, and remove us from the list of so-called state sponsors of terrorism. Cuba should never have been on this list, and we several weeks ago expressed our position. This was expressed by our Cuban president, and he said, quote, "Cuba will continue to defend its democracy and its socialist model, which has over decades demonstrated what a developing country can do, a small country and with small natural resources. We will continue our transformative efforts to find a way out from the embargo in place by U.S. imperialism and means to achieve prosperity with justice, social justice that our people deserve." Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of Cuba. May I take it that it's the wish of the Assembly to conclude its consideration of the agenda item 38? It is so decided. The meeting is adjourned. Thank you.
We were watching live the plenary session of the UN General Assembly, which has just adjourned after the vote on the need to lift the embargo on Cuba, where an overwhelming majority of the nations represented at the organism have voted in favor of the resolution to end the unilateral embargo imposed on the island nation, which has been unfairly imposed for over 60 years, hindering Cuba's possibility to develop its full potential and especially harming the well-being of its people. Specifically, 187 countries voted in favor of the resolution to lift the embargo, while only 2, the United States and Israel, voted against it, and Ukraine abstained. Earlier today and yesterday, representatives from worldwide nations expressed their rejection of unilateral measures against Cuba and the Cuban people, deemed arbitrary and hypocritical. Cuban Foreign Minister Bruno Rodriguez Parrilla introduced a draft resolution presented by Cuba to the international community year after year to lift the blockade and highlighted the way in which the embargo hinders the Cuban government's efforts to provide the most basic products for its people, a situation for which the country calls to the international community to raise its voice against such measures. We will be following closely any updates related to this topic and any related issues, so stay tuned for upcoming news briefs.